Hello, and welcome to How Green is Your Deal, a podcast about Europe's path to climate neutrality. This podcast is part of GreenDeal-NET, a Jean Monnet network that brings together research and teaching on EU climate and sustainability governance. My name is Jana Geuns, and in this episode we are going to talk about climate adaptation, which basically means the efforts to manage and to limit climate change impacts. For this, I am joined by Lisanne Groen, Assistant Professor in International Environmental Governance at the Open Universiteit of the Netherlands. In the past, she has worked on the EU's role in international climate negotiations at the VUB and on technology transfers at the United Nations University. Currently, she's finalizing the lockin project on climate adaptation policy. Hi, Lisanne. I'm so excited to have you here today to talk about climate adaptation. So in your career, you've now worked on a lot of different aspects of climate policy, and more recently, specifically on climate adaptation. Can you tell us a little bit more about what actually is climate adaptation and what made you interested in researching it?
Yeah, sure. I'm also, first of all, very happy to be here talking to you. So what is climate adaptation? You already gave a definition of it. When you think of the word adaptation, you think of we have to adjust something. And in terms of climate adaptation, it's that there's climate change. So we have to make adjustments because of the effects that climate change has. And that means it can be effects that you see already now, but also effects in the future. So it's also about planning for the future and how we can better arrange our societies so that we are better prepared to deal with the consequences of climate change. And what made me interested in this topic? As you said, I've already been dealing with several aspects of climate change. And what I've seen over time is that there's not enough effort put in climate mitigation, so reducing emissions. And because of that, you see more effects of climate change. So I was, trying to find a way to do something with adaptation, because also in adaptation, you see there are reports on the gap that there is. So there are current policies on adaptation, and then there is what could be done, and there is a gap, what is actually necessary, and there's a gap between those two things. And I was wondering, why is there this gap, and what can we do to close that gap? And so there has to be research on this. And then I was very fortunate to find a very interesting project at the Open Universiteit of the Netherlands that was the lockin project. And that was particularly looking at this concept of lock-in and how that is influencing climate adaptation. And then I thought, this is, I think, a very interesting project. I should apply. And then luckily, I got the position there to work on this project. And that's how I started really doing the research on adaptation.
Yeah, that was lucky then for you to have it at the time. So basically, we have these two big concepts then, like climate mitigation and climate adaptation, both for perhaps reducing climate change and then also for trying to limit climate change impacts. And in both of them, we then also see kind of a discrepancy between, what we actually need to be doing and then what is actually being done. Yeah. So I know for now this lockin, like that's something you specifically looked at for climate adaptation. Can you say a little bit more about, what are these lock-ins? What did you find in your research?
When I talk about the concept of lock-in, I find it the easiest to explain by talking about carbon lock-in. And that comes from the field of climate change mitigation. So basically we are still locked into a society that is based on fossil fuels. And we want to move away from that and go to a society based on renewables and other ways to keep emissions low or completely phase them out. And this carbon lock-in then means what I already said, that we are kind of in a status quo that is based on fossil fuels, and that has been constructed over a very long time period. And that means that bit by bit, all parts of the society, of the system, have adapted to working with fossil fuels. So it's not only the infrastructure itself that has been built around this, but also organizations have adapted to using fossil fuels for many different product services that they are dealing with. And then also individuals in society, citizens, they also do their daily things based on the system that is based on fossil fuels. So then to adjust, then you have to adapt routines, and that is a difficult process. And that's what we then studied in our project. So we looked at what is the current status of a certain policy, for example, on sea level rise, and then we went back into time to see like how did this situation come about that we have the current policy that is there. And then you look at many different elements in society that have created routines over time, and then we applied the concept of lock-in mechanisms, and that's kind of a self-reinforcing loop. If over time you start using a certain technology, then that becomes more and more cheap to use, and then the alternative to switch to that alternative becomes more and more costly and difficult. So that's kind of how it works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's basically also a bit of historical research, going into the past and seeing how things have evolved and how we came to be like on this path. And like you said, it must be like really difficult to then break out of these lock-ins as well. Do you have some more concrete examples of some of the lock-ins you found in the Netherlands or in other parts of Europe, and perhaps also some solutions?
So when we look at sea level rise, for example, in the Netherlands, there is actually a pretty good system in place. So we have a delta plan with a delta law, delta fund that is looking at how we should deal with sea level rise to make sure that everybody stays safe. And that's then really looking into the long-term future. But that whole policy is based very much on technology. So technology is going to protect us. And at some point in the future, sea level rise might be so large that it's going to be maybe very costly to continue with technological solutions. So we have to also think of some alternatives. Maybe giving up some part of the land. That's maybe better to just move away from certain places. And that's of course a very difficult political discussion. And at the moment, such solutions are not yet really put on the table because of this, being so politically sensitive. And there we see a bit of a lock-in, so that we stay on the course that we have already, so successfully developed over the years with the Delta works. These are really protecting the Netherlands. So most people think everything is okay, like that we can just continue and improve the technology and that's it. But there are, some alternatives are there that, we should also consider. And to get out of such a situation is then really to open up, the actors that are involved in the policy to the alternatives and to make that discussion possible. Of course, that doesn't happen so quickly. It's really a process of several small steps. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the technological solutions you refer to, those are more like building dikes and stuff like this.
Yeah.
And then alternatives would really be talking about relocation, which I can imagine is very difficult. Like you said, if you have to start addressing that with people, that they might have to move and leave their land or their place behind. Even in Belgium, it's sometimes difficult to convince people to move from Antwerp to Brussels. So I can imagine if you really have to leave it behind, it's really difficult to take these steps towards a more transformational change that's possible. So I know that the project also looked at different countries, not only the Netherlands. Did you find any remarkable differences between lock-ins in these different countries? And maybe perhaps things that we can learn from how they do it somewhere else?
Yeah. What I already said about the Netherlands and their approach to sea level rise, well, that they have this delta plan is actually something that we did not see in Germany and the UK, England, so the other two places we looked at. What we noticed in the Netherlands is that because they have already dealt with sea level rise for such a long time, and there was this big disaster in 1953 where many people died, then they have decided, let's take this seriously, and over time they have developed this really long-term approach. And when you look, for example, at England, then you see that there more often there are floods. So there the approach is not as structural as in the Netherlands. And when it comes to other topics, there we have looked also at biodiversity, for example, forestry, and then you see in the Netherlands that there is quite a strong lobby of the farmers. And they have, of course, also economic incentives. They have specific ways of working that then also, for example, affected how they deal with draining water from the land. And in terms of drought, that is often then not a good approach, because they quickly drain water and then the land gets too dry. So when the climate change made drought more apparent, more often being there, then the farmers were realizing, okay, maybe we have to do something, but it was not such an easy process. No.
So there's always a little bit of the specific context that differs country by country that can make it difficult to also extrapolate some solutions across places. And then even perhaps if you still have the same kind of natural disasters like floods, it doesn't mean that it will always have the same response just because of how everything is organized. So then there's a final question. I like to ask a little bit more of a personal question. You've also talked about this carbon lock-in and that we are in a fossil fuel society that sometimes makes it hard to make a difference or take some individual action, because you are really part of this system. But nonetheless, if you could recommend people to take one climate action that they can do as an individual, what would you say?
I find this a nice question. If you look at the carbon footprint, so what has a large impact on your own carbon footprint, then I think transport has an impact, and especially, of course, flying. So I would say try to think about your holidays that you planned for the year. Maybe say I only fly one time instead of maybe going 2 or 3 times somewhere. And if it's in Europe, maybe you consider going by train instead of taking the plane, or find other ways to get to your destination. And what I also find important is to educate yourself on climate change. So what are the solutions possible that you could take? And also, just to get more knowledgeable on the subject. And then you can also spread that knowledge, so share it with others who are maybe not so knowledgeable yet. And a nice example is that a colleague of mine at the Open University of the Netherlands, he has written together with somebody else a book for children on the carbon footprint, to explain in a nice way for children, like what is the carbon footprint and how can they influence it. Yeah.
That's really nice. And of course, you can always recommend them this podcast as well to get educated. But also, of course, the flying versus other modes of transportation. That's always like a classic as well. And if you take the train, you also have the added benefits, of course, of seeing the beautiful landscape that you're going through and getting a sense of your travel.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot, Lisanne, for coming today. I had a really nice discussion. And thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
That's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to How Green Is Your Deal on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. If you want to stay informed on GreenDeal-NET's activities, please go to greendealnet.eu and subscribe to the newsletter.